Hello to all of my members and welcome to this extended version of how to create depth in your watercolour landscape paintings. To achieve the depth in your landscapes especially, you can use something called aerial or atmospheric perspective. And there's lots of different techniques that you can use, and I'm going to try and cover them all in this tutorial. So, shall we get started? This is the gorgeous photograph that I'm going to be using as a reference. You can see I've got some distance there, some middle ground, and some gorgeous foreground. A link for this photograph can be found in the description below. For a full list of all the materials I'm using, colours and colour alternative, you can also find these in the description below, along with Amazon links if you'd like to purchase any of the materials. So as an added bonus to my members, I'm just going to talk about the selection of colours, why I chose these colours, but also about colour alternative. This is M. Graham's Turquoise, so I want to use a cool blue, but you could use Phthalo Turquoise, Phthalo Blue, Prussian Blue even. This is Ultramarine, but you could use Cobalt Blue or even Cerulean actually, but they're a nice cool and a nice warm blue. This is Quinacridone Magenta, but you could use Permanent Rose. It's just really to get some soft greys in the sky with a little bit of warmth and also in the water. This is Quinacridone Gold, but you could use raw Sienna as well. It's really just to get some interesting greens. And this is Permanent Yellow by Rowney, but you could use Hansa Yellow Light, Cadmium Yellow, any brands really. So this is just the sort of starter colours here. I'm just starting off now with the these turquoise blue, and I'm adding a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, a little bit more of the turquoise, just to get a really nice dark green here. You can see I'm struggling a little bit to get the green that I want to. It's not bad, but it's not quite dark enough. So I thought to myself, I didn't want to use burnt sienna or Quinacridone rust, but I'm afraid I have to get a really lovely dark green. And you can do so. You can also use burnt umber as a substitute. I'm using Quinacridone rust, but as I say, you could use burnt umber or burnt sienna as an alternative. Straight away, look at that gorgeous dark green that I've created there. You could also use something like indigo or Payne's grey with the Quinacridone Gold or yellow to make a beautiful dark green also. So I hope you find that useful, and it's a good idea just to test out your colours and just play around with them to see if you can sort of get the colours that you want here. This is the turquoise with some yellow here, and it's just to kind of create sort of a cooler green here at the top and then a little bit of a warmer green at the bottom there. So I've mixed up a little bit of ultramarine and a little bit of pink, and it's to get the colour of the water and the sky. So I'm making a blue violet, and then I'm adding a pinch. You could use the Quinacridone Gold or the burnt sienna, or as I'm using Quinacridone rust, and just add a pinch to that, just to kind of, what it does, it neutralises that violet. So you've still got a hint of a grey violet there. It's quite a good colour mix there. You can also just use the yellow as well if you want to add yellow, but there's a beautiful grey violet. I thought that's quite a good colour match for the sky, the distant mountains, as well as the water also. And you can blue it up a little bit more as well. So have a little play around with that as well. Before you start painting, it's always a good idea just to test out those colours, so you feel more confident as well when you're colour mixing. This, I'm going to use a little pinch of ultramarine, rinse my brush there, and a little pinch of the Quinacridone Gold, just to make a blue green, which is a cooler green, might be quite nice for the distant mountains and trees. And then I've added a little bit more Quinacridone Gold, and look at the difference there between the sort of the turquoise and the Quinacridone Gold to the right, and then this with the ultramarine and the Quinacridone Gold. So when you mix a warm or cool blue, you'll get different results. And this is the ultramarine with the permanent yellow, and again you can see it's a lot more warmer. Interesting, isn't it? Just looking at the difference between the ultramarine and the yellow and the turquoise and the yellow. That's much more brighter and garish, almost, the turquoise and the yellow. This is Quinacridone rust with the ultramarine. Now this makes a lovely sort of dark brown, or it could make a cool grey, almost like an artist's Payne's grey. So these are the colours that I'm going to be using in the tutorial, and I hope you found this colour mixing exercise useful. So on to the preparation for the drawing. As you can see, there's quite a bit of drawing that I've done in the foreground. Now you don't have to do as much. You could just outline the top of the Queen Anne's lace and maybe draw some of the daisies, but sometimes you can just literally paint those with masking fluid. But if you're more comfortable with the drawing, go for it. I'm using Jackson's Art Supplies blue masking fluid. I'm using a liner brush. I've dipped it into liquid soap and I'm just sort of masking out the daisies, as you can see there. I will let these dry naturally, and of course my brush is protected only while the liquid soap, which is hand soap, is on the brush. So if you rinse your brush, you'll need to apply more hand soap while you're using the masking fluid. So I'm actually now painting the Queen Anne's lace, so it's lots of little dots and stippling. And I have to say, it felt quite sort of frustrating almost. I didn't mind painting or masking out the daisies, but this just felt a little bit fiddly. So as I was doing this, I was thinking there must be an easier way of doing this. For not just for me, but I was thinking of you guys, you know, all my members sort of stippling away thinking, why has she given this up for us to do? She's so cruel. Because to me it's almost too fiddly and too detailed. So I'm using an old Scourer here and I'm tearing it. Don't cut it, tear it. It's a little bit tricky to tear it, so you might need to get someone with stronger fingers. But so it's at an angle, so there's little loose bits of green bits. And now I'm applying the masking fluid. I've not tried to protect it because I'll probably bin this afterwards. But I'm applying the masking fluid, and because it's quite rough and everything, you get these more textured effects. Now, don't use your natural sponge with this because it will ruin it. The masking fluid isn't very kind to a natural sponge. So I'm very lightly, gently tapping the watercolour paper here and applying the masking fluid. As you can see, I put a little bit of masking fluid in the lid. I found it was easier to tap the sponge before I put it on the painting. Otherwise you end up with a big blob on your sponge. So now I'm going to spatter some masking fluid back with my liner brush. You can use a small round brush as well. Make sure it's an old one, not your best brushes for masking. And I'm just tapping the brush and allowing a little bit of spatter on the sort of top part of the Queen Anne's lace and a little bit around the daisies as well. As you can see there, I did put some paper towel around my sky area as well. But if any little dots escape, you can always sort of rub them off once your masking fluid has dried naturally. And make sure you rinse your brush afterwards. So this is ultramarine with a tiny touch of pink, and I'm going to use a little smidge of raw sienna or a quinacridone gold in there, a very tiny amount. So it's a kind of a grey violet, and this is for the sky colour. So I'm wetting the sky area first. Make sure you make your wash before you do that, because otherwise if you wet your paper, it's just gonna dry again. And I'm using a small size 6 brush, very watered down quinacridone gold, painting wet in wet on the horizon area. Rinse my brush off there, and now I'm painting that sort of grey violet colour wet into wet, leaving gaps as well for the clouds, pretty much how it is in the photograph. There's a lot of white as well. I've added a touch more ultramarine in the top right hand corner and a little bit of a faded ultramarine look towards the horizon there. I'm just trying to make the sky look quite random. I'm adding a little bit more clouds. I've made this a touch darker with the ultramarine with a touch of the quinacridone rust just on the left hand side there to build up some darker tones at the top of the sky. So my first technique with aerial perspective is tonal values. So darker tones come forwards. The top of the sky is nearer to us. The sky going towards the horizon is miles away, so it's lighter in tone. Already I'm creating depth just in that top part of my sky. So I hope you find that useful. The other thing about tone is contrast, light and dark. So I'm actually lifting out some lighter clouds here, creating some hard edges as well to make this look like it's nearer to us. So you've got the contrast of light and dark tones that immediately create depth in your painting. I don't want you to worry about this too much, especially if it's new to you. Just let the ideas sort of sink in. It really does almost become second nature after a while. What I'm doing now is I'm wetting the water area. So the furthest part of this water, the tonal values will be a lot lighter as it is in the photograph. And then the tonal values as it comes towards you on the left-hand side get darker. So that immediately makes it look like it's coming towards you. So now I'm putting on a very, very pale sort of blue with a touch of pink, a touch of the Quinacridone rust, very, very pale. I'm also leaving some white gaps as well, so lots of light there as well. But you haven't got a big contrast of light and dark. They're quite near to each other on the tonal scale there. I'm using my size 6 brush and I'm working wet in wet. If you feel you go too dark here, just lift off with a paper towel as well. Don't worry, these colours do come off okay. So now I'm building up slightly darker tone because this is the middle distance, so I want to build up a slightly stronger tonal value here. So I'm mixing up the 3 colours again. If you're finding it tricky mixing those colours, just make a blue violet, so mostly ultramarine, tiny touch of pink, then a tiny touch of either the Quinacridone gold, the yellow or the brown, whichever you decide. Sometimes the brown, it's a darker colour, it will make darker tonal greys as well. So this is the darkest one here and I'm painting it more in the foreground or the nearest bit of water to me. I do make some adjustments to this later as well, but I hope this explanation helps explain about why tonal values are important to create depth in landscape painting. So I'm using my size 6 brush. I'm just painting on a creamier, darker tonal value here, just to the left, damp into damp, using the same colour, just slightly thicker. And here it's a little bit thicker as well. I've made that quite a bit darker. I do actually lighten this up later because I actually lift this off, just to let you know that's coming. But for main reason is I felt that it was too dark there and it pulled my eye away, and in a way I wish I'd made it lighter. So just to point that out, if you're painting this along with me now, just make that a little bit lighter. So I'm just painting a little bit of darker reflection underneath these 2 little islands here. Damp into damp as well. If you find it's running too much, you can do this wet on dry later. So I'm just using my brush now, my size 6 brush, just to paint some little darks here in the sort of middle distance, but softening. I don't want them as dark as the foreground. So I've allowed my painting to dry, so I'm painting the furthest distant hill first of all, using my size 10 brush, working wet on dry, and I've used the same mix, the ultramarine, with a touch of pink and a touch of the burnt sienna, and I'm just softening just below that there, so you won't have a hard edge when you paint your next mountain or hill. So I'm just adding a smidge of turquoise there. You could use Prussian blue, just at the very sort of distant hill there. And I've just rinsed my brush and I'm just softening any hard edges to the left here, so that when I come to paint the next mountain, you've got a nice soft edge there. You haven't got 2 hard edges bumped up against one another like a jigsaw puzzle. So one looks like it's behind the other. It creates that illusion. I'm just painting this hill here to the right hand side, adding water at the bottom to really make it look very pale in the distance. While that's drying off, I've mixed up a little bit of turquoise and permanent yellow, but you could use Prussian blue and lemon yellow or cadmium yellow. And I'm painting this wet on wet with my size 10 brush in the foreground. Just make sure your masking fluid is dry. If you don't have masking fluid, you could use white gouache instead at the end of the painting. So I'm just putting a little bit more yellow in there as well and letting my brush dance around. For the trees behind the daisies and the Queen Anne's lace, I mixed up a little bit of ultramarine with some Quinacridone gold and just painting this wet on wet also. So these colours are a lot brighter than the distant colours here, and when you're using colours, technique number 2 is to use sort of warmer colours in the foreground, and as you can can see in the distance there, I've used cooler colours, and cooler colours appear to recede and warmer ones come forward, so lots of yellows and reds and browns. For more information about warm and cool colours, I will put a link in the description below of a recent video I published about them. So you can see I'm using darker tonal values here, wet into wet, using the turquoise with the burnt sienna. I'm deliberately using a very dark green as a process of using strong tonal values. So once I take the masking fluid off, I'm going to have white daisies and I'm having a really dark background around them, and it really pulls them forward and creates depth. So I'm just dropping in this luscious dark green, wet into wet, almost letting the paint travel as well, still using my size 10 brush. If you find using a smaller brush easier, do so. I'm using a little bit of the Quinacridone gold, mixing up the different dark greens, getting different shades, even creamier and even darker. And I'm still using my size 10 brush, but I've decided to swap to my size 6, as you saw there, just to get some smaller marks now, because I'm painting in some stems and leaves damp into damp. As you can see, I'm leaving lots of light there as well, so you need your light, the contrasting lights and darks. I'm mixing up a little bit of the Quinacridone rust now with the turquoise to make an even darker green if it was possible, and just painting this damp into damp here and there, especially around some of the daisies. What you don't want is to take off your masking fluid later and just have light green behind. There won't be enough contrast, and those white daisies and Queen Anne's lace won't stand out. I'm now painting damp into damp here, quite dark, to separate some of the trees in the middle distance here, using my size 6 brush with the Quinacridone rust. You can use burnt sienna and the turquoise, and you can use Prussian blue or phthalo blue. When I take off my masking fluid later, I'm going to have hard edges, and hard edges come forward because they're quite detailed and they're almost textured in a way because they've got a lovely dark rim around them. Soft edges, wet into wet, especially if you look at the sky in the distance, it's softer and it recedes because it's got fuzzy edges. Watercolour is brilliant for creating depth just by using the soft wet and wet edges, and these fuzzy edges and the crisp hard edges of wet in wet. As you can see here, I'm using my sponge with some creamy green paint, and I'm using the edges that again just on the very edge here to create crisp texture. So texture also creates depth in painting, and as you can see here, it brings those trees and bushes forward away from the water. It's more kind of my middle ground here, but I want to bring that forward to create depth, so it comes away from the water, away from the mountains and away from the sky. It's so effective by using these different techniques. I'm using a natural sponge and quite creamy paint. Make sure you make plenty of paint as well when you're sponging. As you can see, I'm also using a plastic card here cut up. It's just an old store card. I'm scratching into the surface of the paper, which is permanent, but this creates texture, and this also brings the foreground forward. So try to avoid putting texture in your distance because it will make your painting look flat. It will just pull it forward. As you can see here, I'm actually sprinkling on some table salt. You can use sea salt around the middle ground and in the foreground, again to create some textures in your painting. The salt will lift the paint, it will soak up the paint and leave some nice light textures. So allow this to happen naturally before you dry your painting. Now I've dried off my painting again, and I'm painting the next hill, slightly darker but still cooler than the distant mountain here, but I don't want the darks to be as strong because I'm going to put another dark in front of it to create this depth. But you can see how this pulls away from the distant mountain with the stronger tone, but also it's a bigger size, and size really does create distance. So objects appear smaller in the distance and larger in the middle ground, and then even bigger in the foreground. So that really will help you create depth in your painting by making objects bigger. So I'm using the Ultramarine with a tiny touch of pink with the Quinacridone rust with my size 10 brush. I mixed up a little bit of ultramarine and yellow here, and it's a kind of a yellow green, and I'm just painting underneath this area here, and I'm just going to bring this right down to the left hand side, wet on dry, with my size 10 brush. I also added a little bit of the Quinacridone gold in there just to kind of vary the greens here. I don't want them too bright, and certainly not as bright as the foreground green, so I'm just softening away there and softening it into the sort of the grey blue just above there. You can use a damp clean brush to blend the grey into the green or vice versa, so you don't get any hard edges. I'm also just painting down to the shoreline there, now mixing up a little bit of yellow green. You could use ultramarine with a touch of yellow, and I'm also using some of the grey blue of the water and the mountains just to grey this down slightly to push it back a little bit. I'm doing the same thing with the central one there, a little bit too much paint, a bit of a blob there. I do actually make both these little islands a little bit big. I do change it later. I think I just got carried away. It's okay at the moment, and they just grew. And I don't know if you have that sometimes in a watercolour painting. Things just keep changing. You don't realise you're doing it sometimes. So I thought I'd point that out. So if you see me doing it, I didn't mean to. And I do correct it later. But these are just cooler colours. And now I'm just taking off a little bit of the darker paint there, just adding a little bit of the Quinacridone gold. I didn't want them too dark, so they came forward too much. I wanted to try to create depth and distance. Obviously I've got that with the size. I just want to make a little bit paler in the tonal value so it doesn't come forward too much. I'm just using a little bit of shadow just along the edge here to create some depth there with my size 10 brush. It's just a darker green, the ultramarine with some Quinacridone gold. You could use raw sienna. So it's not a bright colour, so it doesn't come forward too much, and the edges are soft, so again it doesn't come forward too much as I'm painting damp into damp. The painting has dried again. I'm using a slightly stronger, darker tonal value here, but I've used ultramarine and a little bit of yellow and not the turquoise, which is a very bright, strong, almost saturated, vibrant colour. You'll find the ultramarine mixed with the yellows sort of sit back a little bit more. The turquoise mixed with yellow is a really bright, almost garish green, and it's just knowing that, and those brighter garish colours come forward more. They're much more vibrant. So I don't want this colour to compete with the foreground greens. However, I do want to bring it forward away from those cooler mountains. So I've made a darker tonal value to bring it forward. And as you can see here, I'm just painting on a little bit of textures and details here. In this middle distance, I'm going to soften it back a bit. Here's wet on dry, and it's the ultramarine with the yellow again, but I'm just softening underneath, using that soft edge to push it back a little bit, because obviously all the details and textures and hard edges are going to be right in the foreground, but I want enough detail here so this pulls away from the distance. So I hope that makes sense, and it creates the sort of middle ground. So you've got the foreground, middle distance and distance, so you're kind of sort of step by step you're using these different techniques to create depth in your landscape watercolour paintings. So I felt this hill on the left here needed a little bit more information. It looked a bit too sort of flat looking. So I've mixed up some creamy ultramarine with a little bit of the yellow, slightly darker, cooler blue, painting damp into damp so I get nice soft fuzzy edges. So it doesn't come forward enough, but it's enough information for the middle ground to balance out everything and come away from the distance as well. And I'm just painting a little bit here with my size 6 brush. It can be wet on dry, and you can soften in this left hand area. I'm doing the same as well to this little island here, pulling this forward away from the distance, but not too much detail that it comes forward too much. I've dried my painting and I'm just brushing off the salt now. As you can see, it's created some lovely light and texture there, especially in the middle ground. And I am sponging wet on dry to create some texture just at the top of those trees and bushes there. Again, to pull that away from the sky and away really from those sort of of the water and the sort of distant hills. And I'm sponging lots more dark as well around the daisies and the Queen Anne lace to really have that contrast. When I take off that masking fluid, I'm going to have some real yummy darks against light, because it's kind of my focal point here. So it's really important to have that. So I'm using this, you can use turquoise with a quinacridone rust or burnt sienna. I'm just tapping in some more darks right in the foreground here. Remember, don't be afraid of the dark. I'm just spritzing some of the darks here with my spritzer bottle to soften them, but also I'm going to add some Brusho, which is a medium I really like to use to create some textures also. If you've not heard of Brusho and you want to know a little bit more about it, I'll put a link for a video I made in the description below all about Brusho. I've dried my painting thoroughly before I took off all of my masking fluid, and I did that with a paper towel. And I am delighted how the Queen Anne's lace has turned out, and the daisies, of course. So the left-hand corner there where the river is, I just don't like it. So I've decided to take it out and soften it. Actually, looking back now, it doesn't look so bad, but at the time I didn't like it. So I'm just using the Scourer, the sponge end of the Scourer, with some clean water and just lifting off the paint there. So my eye doesn't rest there, and I want everyone to look at the daisies and not at that corner. I'm just taking all the excess liquid or dampness off with my paper towel, ensuring that dampness doesn't create a background somewhere. Mind you, it might create some nice textures. I have got a sort of a light bit there which I want to disguise now, so I'm using a sponging technique, using a light green and just sponging the sort of the tops of the trees there on the left hand side, using some yellow and some blues there, can be the turquoise, but it's a very sort of yellow green and it's warm and it comes forward away from the background there. I'm also using some darks with my mapping pen. You could use your twig to create some texture and detail there as well. So while that's drying off a bit, I am mixing up a nice warm sunny yellow. So I've actually cheated and used red here. It's the permanent yellow with some cadmium red, and I'm painting the centre of the daisies wet on dry using my size 4 brush. This warm colour, think of the sunshine, comes forward and really creates depth and pulls away from that middle distance and the background. Try to vary the centres of the daisies as well. Don't have them all as circles, have some of them as ellipses and, you know, sort of squished ovals, so they look like they're sort of at different angles as well. And obviously you can see the white of the daisies really stands out against the green backgrounds, light, dark and mid-tone shades. What we are doing here is creating details. Detailed objects come forward. So I'm giving lots of detail in the foreground here with the daisies, you know, dropping in some warmer tones as well, a little bit more red to one side. And what you don't want to do is put any details in the distance, because it will flatten your painting, as it will immediately come forward. That's why using aerial perspective really helps create depth in your watercolour landscape paintings. So I'm going to do the same here with the stems, and the leaves will also come forward, creating depth. So you can go mad in the foreground with all those yummy details spattering, and you know, the salt, the Brusho, it all creates really nice textures and details. So I'm painting a mid-green. I'm using that bright, vibrant turquoise with the yellow there to make this garish green almost to come forward. I'm using sort of dark, mid and light greens, wet on dry using my size 4 brush. What I'm doing now is I'm spattering, but think of spattering as lots of tiny little bits of detail to create the look of the Queen Anne's lace. It's quite nice to do. I'm using white Winsor & Newton gouache. It's an opaque medium and it's really useful, especially if you've lost your light or you don't want to use masking fluid, and you can use the white gouache instead. Sometimes painting round something like this is very tricky to do, so it's a great alternative. As you can see, I'm also stippling there with my size 4 brush. I thought I'd paint some shadows on the daisies with this little bit of detail here. It's a very, very watered down grey violet that I produce for the sky, and it's just very soft shadows. Try not to make them too dark and only paint a few. Exaggerate the light and white of those daisies. If you find you do too much, remember to lift off straight away with a paper towel, and you can soften some of the darks as well. But I'm pulling them from the centre out with this size 4 brush, just with these little marks here. It just makes them look a little bit more 3D, brings them forward from the sort of middle distance as well because of the detail. I actually mixed up a little bit of white with the yellow with a touch of the turquoise for a really sort of bright limey green that really comes forward away from some of the darks there. In the foreground, I'm doing the same between the Queen Anne's lace. If you look up close to the photograph, not this tiny little thumbnail, but the larger photograph online, you'll see some really light stems with Queen Anne's lace. And I'm giving another little spatter here and there, wet on dry. This is a little bit of unseen footage here. I've mixed up some ultramarine with a touch of pink and a touch of the burnt sienna to make that grey, that violet grey, and then added some white just to fill in here a little bit on the left, to try and match that colour there. I felt I needed to get that sort of colour of the water there, but again felt that was too dark tonally, so I'm adding a little bit more white, and I quite like that colour match there. And I'm just adding a little bit more light here just below the green here, using my size 4 brush, and then just softening with a damp brush underneath. I'm doing the same on the right hand side here, just really to get some of my light back. The only caution I will give you here, sometimes when you do that you can get a bit carried away, so remember less is more. Again, another little spatter. I protected my sky and water with some paper towel and just spattering some loose sort of white gouache just to the top of the Queen Anne's lace. So I was kind of finished there, so I'm removing my washi tape, so it's got a really nice white border, and it gives me time to assess this painting to see if I need to do any more to it. And actually I gave myself a night and a day to have a look at it, to see, to be really objective, to see if I needed to make any more changes. As I mentioned earlier, this island did get a little big. I don't know how it happened, it just grew. So I'm using a stencil brush, which is like a hog hair brush, just to remove some of the paint on the right and left side. Using clean water, you can use a magic sponge or an old synthetic brush, and then use your paper towel to lift off any excess paint. I'm just using a little bit of white now to disguise some of that paint that I took off there with some white gouache there, and I'm also adjusting the size of this island here just to the right using some white gouache and my size 4 brush. I'm using some ultramarine and yellow, painting wet on dry, the water's edge here to the left, and then just softening underneath just to give a little bit more detail there. I felt I needed some more daisies in the picture to come up further, so I'm actually sort of borrowing from the Queen Anne's lace to make them look like daisies and painting some warm yellow paint into the centres. You can see there I'm also painting some more Queen Anne's lace. This might be useful for some of you that don't like masking fluid as well. It actually goes on really nicely. I'm also adding a little bit of white into the water above here and softening with a damp brush just to give it a little bit of sparkle and light. And I'm using my size 4 brush with some ultramarine with a tiny touch of the Quinacridone gold, painting some darks on the water's edge here. I think I lifted this too much off previously, and I wanted to match it to the centre of the water's edge there. I'm painting a little bit more dark in the centre of the daisies there with a mixture of the Quinacridone rust and a touch of the ultramarine, just to define the very foreground daisies there, to make them look a little bit more 3D. I thought it'd be quite nice to add a few birds. Plus, as you can see, I had a few little spots there, little spot of blue, little splashes there of paint. So what better than to paint birds? And I thought it'd be great to show that they're larger and darker at the top, smaller and paler towards the horizon. Again, following the rules and techniques of atmospheric perspective. Because I moved the daisies up, I thought it'd be quite nice to move the Queen Anne's lace up as well. This white gouache really goes on well on the green as well. I'm using my size 4 brush. You can use even a smaller brush to create this detail here, but I wanted it to sort of stand out. I've painted some very light stems here as well, mixing some white with the green, and I think it's got better balance. I'm painting a few more dark stems in the foreground, so I'm sort of finishing off with some darks and details. I don't want to overwork this, and I'm very mindful of this all the way through this as well. You know, this less is more, but I just wanted to make these few alterations and to show you what I did behind the scenes, as it were. So I really hope you found that helpful, that bonus footage. And if you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. And if you would like to share your work, remember you can do so on the members Facebook page. Thank you so much for all of your support on the memberships. I really appreciate it. Happy painting. Bye for now.